A young woman calls her father from a train station in Philadelphia, asking for a ride home. But in the 30 minutes it takes her father to get there, she completely vanished off the face of the earth. So what led up to this strange disappearance, and what happened to her? Julie Barnyock was 18 at the time of our case, almost 30 years ago back in 1993. She lived with her family in New Britain, a small town north of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She was a recent graduate of the Central Bucks West High School, ready to get out and live her life as an adult. She was known to have a lot of friends. She was seen as incredibly kind, but maybe too much at times. Some people who were around at the time say that she was a little naive when it came to dealing with people. She would sometimes hang around with a bit of a sketchy crowd that she normally didn't really fit in too well with. She was simply just nice and didn't really discriminate like that. However, it seems that came at a pretty great cost. This incident took place at the Lansdale, Pennsylvania train station almost 30 years ago on November 8th of 1993. Julie had been in Philadelphia that day with a friend, a man named Brian Todd. Friends and acquaintances would later go on to say that Todd was known to be homeless at the time, but it seemed that Julie was fairly close friends with him at least. That evening, Julie exited an R5 SEPTA train at the Lansdale train station at approximately 11:40 p.m., coming home after having spent the day with Todd. Witnesses saw her talking to a man in his 20s on the train platform, but who exactly the man was has never been identified. It's safe to assume that it was Todd, but the witnesses were unable to provide enough information to lead to a good sketch of the man, so we're left with pretty vague detail here. About half an hour after arriving at that station, she made a phone call home to her father. About 30 to 40 witnesses who were at the station at the time reported seeing her make the call, but it didn't seem anyone was with her. Julie asked her father to please pick her up from the station and give her a ride home. She also talked to her mother for a bit, who noticed that, although she didn't say anything too suspicious, she did seem nervous. The phone call ended abruptly with the receiver seemingly being slammed down. Julie was then spotted by witnesses leaving the train station. From their statements, it seemed that she left the station willingly. But sensing some urgency in the situation and hurrying out there, about 30 minutes later, Julie's father arrived to pick her up. However, he couldn't find her anywhere. After searching for a while and thinking that hopefully she just found another ride back home, he decided to drive back home himself. He and his wife waited around until the next morning for Julie to come back home, and unfortunately, she never did. It was at this point that they called the New Britain Township Police and reported her missing. Police launched a full-on missing person search as her family held out hope that this was all just a big misunderstanding and she'd be found alive and well pretty soon after. Word about her going missing spread around town, and her friends soon heard about the case. They were worried, but figured that she may just be sleeping at a friend's house somewhere. I mean, this was before cell phones, and they hoped it was not really as big of a deal as it seemed to be. That hope waned over time. She would remain missing until the day of December 2nd, about 3 weeks later. A man was walking through a train yard adjacent to the one where Julia went missing, out in an overgrown area in a freight yard known for being a regular spot for the homeless. In this little traversed area, he would stumble upon the badly decomposed body of Julie Barnyock. Police were notified, her body was collected, and an autopsy was performed. It was found that she had been severely beaten and ultimately died of severe head trauma. Unfortunately, though, that's about all they could figure out. Other tests were attempted, but she was in such a bad state of decay that any test for any sort of other kinds of assault came up inconclusive. Few details were revealed to the public. The local police force struggled to come up with much evidence at all. They were pretty used to the small-town life. Most of the crimes they tended to tackle were related to small-time weed dealers and bar fights. Some people in town made it known that they felt the police were pretty in over their head with this one. Over time, though, various suspects would come into the spotlight. First and foremost, the man she had been hanging out with that day, Brian Todd, the 22-year-old homeless man. Brian had been living around Philadelphia at the time and was known to be a frequent visitor to South Street, the area that he and Julie had visited the day of her disappearance. 2 days after Julie's disappearance, before the police had even found her, Julie's mom had an interesting interaction with Brian outside of her home. She was coming home from the grocery store when suddenly Brian came up out of nowhere, as if he was hiding in the bushes and waiting for her. He came closer and asked her, "Have you called the police?" He then soon asked the additional question, "Did they check the train yard? There's a lot of places you can hide a body." This was, without a doubt, alarming, given the circumstances. However, Brian Todd was a very hard man to find, being homeless and all. In 2001, 8 years later, police detectives stated that they were still trying to contact him for further questioning to no avail. He hadn't been around since shortly after the body was found. Police were holding out hope that someone from Philadelphia who knew Brian would come forth and give some information about what he did on the day of Julie's disappearance, and on the days after. It doesn't seem like they ever really had any luck. A second suspect that soon came forth was a 23-year-old man named Scott Hutchins. He had begun serving a lengthy 21 to 43-year prison sentence in 1995. At that very same Lansdale station in 1994, 1 year after what happened to Julie, he stabbed and killed a young woman. This caused the police to wonder if, possibly, he had done the same thing 1 year earlier. He was never formally connected to the crime, though. He was paroled in December of 2019 and seemingly still walks free today. Possibly the biggest and most thoroughly researched suspect was a man named Arthur Bomar. He was living in the Lansdale area at the time when Julie was killed. It later came to be known that he was working as an orderly at a Doyleton hospital in 1992 during a time when Julie had been a patient at the hospital. Bomar was charged in the murder of a college athlete named Amy Willard, whose body was similarly found in a badly beaten state in an overgrown North Philadelphia lot in 1996. He was also the prime suspect, but never charged, in the murder of a woman named Maria Cabuenos, whose skeleton was found in a far-off wooded area in the Tinicum Township. However, the police were never able to come up with enough evidence to properly link Bomar to Julie's case. According to Montgomery County District Attorney Michael Mariano, there were actually some factors leading investigators to believe that he couldn't have been the one that killed Julie. However, neither he nor the Lansdale police chief would elaborate on exactly what ruled Bomar out as a suspect. Mr. Bomar is impossible to ignore, but I can't say that he's a suspect at this time. There isn't a great deal of evidence pointing to him, said the Lansdale police chief. However, they would later go on to add that Bowman hadn't been completely ruled out. Julie's family always considered him to be the most obvious suspect at hand, and they were pretty disappointed with the seeming lack of effort that went into connecting him to the case. Either way, Bowman's already on death row as it is. If he did commit the crime, he'd likely end up with the same punishment he's about to get anyway, so for those who think that he did do it, maybe that's of some consolation. A large part of the mystery of what happened to Julie is exactly what happened between the time she got off the train and the time she called her father. And, of course, what caused her to leave the train station without even waiting for her ride. Police still don't know if she was abducted or left willingly for some reason, as witnesses stated. Another big factor to the mystery is the fact that her body was in such a state that not much testing could be done. A proper kit couldn't even be taken, as the blood, fluids, and hair fibers were already gone by the time she was found. The forensic evidence had already long rotted away. Not only that, but DNA evidence wasn't nearly as commonplace as it is today. However, the Lansdale police still hope to solve this 28-year-old case and finally bring the killer to justice. But despite hundreds and hundreds of man-hours, all of the witness interviews, and all of the forensic testing, the case still remains unsolved. Nobody has ever once been charged in the case, but that's something that investigators hope will soon change. It seems to this day that they do have at least a number of suspects in the case, saying, "We have a couple of people at the top of the list," implying that there is a list. Just recently, the investigators have reopened the case, and the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office has offered a fat $10,000 reward for anyone who can give out any information that leads to the arrest and conviction for those responsible for the crime. They hope that the reward money will add a little bit of incentive for more people to come forth with a little more information on the case who may not have before. SEPTA has been helping out by posting flyers up on their trains. They hope that the so-called unsolvable crime can be solved with some good old-fashioned police work, some detective skills, in combination with modern equipment and modern crime-solving methods. The case is still regularly reviewed by these detectives who feel that it's still their obligation to carry the case forward. We don't ever stop. Despite the fact that there's no one left here that was here on the day that Julie's body was found, that obligation on part of the men and women of this department continues, they said. But as of the making of this video, Julie Barnyock's killer has never been brought to justice. If by some long shot you happen to have any information about this case, please feel free to contact the Montgomery County Detective Bureau or the Lansdale Police. I've got their numbers up on screen now, as well as in the description. If you prefer to lay low but still have some kind of information to give, anonymous tips can be texted using Montco Crime Tips on the Stop It app. Hopefully there's some information out there that can finally finish this. So, thank you again for watching my videos. This one was actually suggested by a friend of mine who lived in the area at the time, so hopefully we can get some information out there. As usual, giving the video a like helps, giving a dislike doesn't do anything, and subscribing is a good way to see more. If you additionally want to help out the channel, I do have a Patreon, which is linked in the description below, and speaking of which, shout out to my top patrons. Jewel G, Wafrans, Callahan, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Alan Damiani, Adrian Lawley, Winnicott, Murray Joel Sanchez, David McLaughlin, Marsh, Buffa Zerk, Lonro, Jewel Movchan, Lori Tayaba, Kim Peak, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Skooky Maine, Foxlicity, Jackie, Teresa Ferguson, and Mark Barnett. Thank you, and goodbye.